The Hydroxychloroquine Scandal, written by Ian Davis of In This Together, read by Alex Thompson of UK Column. The written form of this article contains 78 hyperlinks to sources. Please do read the original at ukcolumn.org and consider subscribing to UK Column to enable more research and publication. From the outset of the coronavirus pandemic and the lockdown regimes that followed, we have been repeatedly told by all the usual suspects, institutions, and the mainstream media that the only way to get back to normal is with a vaccine, precisely echoing the calls of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Certainly, the British government was quick to invest in vaccine development. In their Coronavirus Action Plan, published on the 3rd of March, the focus was overwhelmingly on vaccines. The action plan noted that a vaccine may not prevent infection from SARS-CoV-2, but could rather manage symptoms of the potentially resultant syndrome, COVID-19. Quote, given that there is neither currently a vaccine against COVID-19 nor any specific proven antiviral medication, most treatment will therefore be towards managing symptoms. Innovate responses, including diagnostics, drugs, and vaccines. End quote. This notion that a proposed vaccine may not actually stop SARS-CoV-2 infections, but rather manage symptoms of COVID-19, was clearly signalled by Pascal Soriot, the Chief Executive Officer of AstraZeneca, who are partnering with Oxford University to develop a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine. Speaking on the BBC's Andrew Marr show on the 24th of May, Soriot stated, "We are quite confident the vaccine will work, actually. The question is, will it completely clear the virus or stop people being sick? This is what happens with the flu vaccine, for instance. It simply stops people from being sick. Being protected against being sick would already be a big plus." End quote. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has so far held a number of discussions with Bill and Melinda Gates about the COVID-19 crisis. On the 4th of June, the British government hosted the Gavi Vaccine Alliance Replenishment Summit in London. The Gates Foundation gave Gavi $1.2 billion in 2019 and was among its founding partners. It has contributed more than $4.1 billion to Gavi during its 2-decade-long mission to create healthy markets for vaccines. Bill Gates and Boris Johnson were the keynote speakers at the summit. In his address, Johnson stated, "I want to say a particular thank you to Bill and Melinda Gates for their generosity, their philanthropy yet again, and their continued leadership in humanity's battle against disease. Just as we have great military alliances like NATO, so we now need that same spirit of collaboration and collective defense against the common enemy of disease. It will require a new international effort to cooperate on the surveillance and sharing of information that can underpin a global alert system. It will need a radical scaling up of our global capacity to respond, exactly as Bill Gates has set out." End quote. As Johnson's comments reveal, there is much more than just healthcare riding on the back of coronavirus vaccine development. The vaccine itself sits at the centre of a web of surveillance, restricted freedom of movement, and restricted access to employment and services based upon your allocated immunity status. A whole new tech industry, combining global corporations and intelligence agencies, is springing up to monitor, control, and surveil populations. Perhaps we could call this the disease intelligence industrial complex. New section, a vaccine that doesn't need to work. Johnson's Coronavirus Action Plan announcement followed the World Health Organization's February summit with the Global Research Collaboration for Infectious Disease Preparedness and Response, abbreviated GLOPID-R. GLOPID-R's list of funding organizations with significant financial interests in vaccine sales is notable. For example, there is the Gates Foundation, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, abbreviated CEPI, the Wellcome Trust, and the French medical research agency INSERM, Institut National de la Santé et de la Recherche Médicale. The two-day summit of the World Health Organization and GLOPID-R took place on the 11th to 12th of February. 1 month later, on the 11th of March, the World Health Organization declared a global coronavirus pandemic. The summit produced the Target Product Profile, TPP, that needs to be met in order for the World Health Organization to approve any proposed COVID-19 vaccine. The World Health Organization would prefer that the vaccine prevent SARS-CoV-2 infections, but it doesn't have to, so long as it reduces the worst effects of COVID-19. It doesn't need to be 100% effective either. 70% is fine. Since, at the time of writing, COVID-19 is said to have impacted 0.1% of the global population, allegedly killing less than 0.006%. The World Health Organization's measure of success for a global vaccine being that it protects 70% of the global population from a disease that doesn't affect 99.9% of the population, then the chances of World Health Organization approval for anything look pretty good. An inert saline solution should do the job. It is not surprising then that vaccine developers are so confidently looking forward to a global market and global profits. A cheap, widely available, off-patent drug that achieves exactly the same thing as the vaccine must therefore be seen as a problem. New section. Why not hydroxychloroquine? When the world is presented with a virus which is claimed to cause a potentially fatal disease for which there is no known treatment, and if our only claimed wish is to save lives, then trialling any and all potential treatments makes obvious sense. Resistance to trials would suggest that saving lives may not be the priority. If the evidence shows that powerful public health bodies and foundations have apparently colluded to stop trials, there can be little doubt that another agenda has taken precedence over saving lives. When the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic, chloroquine, and its modern form hydroxychloroquine, were the most obvious candidates for investigative clinical trials. Its possible effectiveness had, after all, been noted since at least 2005. Scientists and doctors around the world took note of early promising clinical trials in China. In France, Professor Didier Raoult, one of the world's most published microbiologists, announced his own trials. He stated that he thought it would be foolish not to try chloroquine more widely. Scientists at Stanford University in California agreed, reporting apparent treatment success in both China and South Korea. The Stanford team also advocated more thorough clinical trials of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. Yet resistance to trialling hydroxychloroquine was immediately evident. Raoul was attacked in France for suggesting hydroxychloroquine could work to prevent the most severe life-threatening symptoms of COVID-19. These attacks, which we would characterize as a disinformation campaign, came from the mainstream media, other scientists who worked for INSERM, and politicians. The persistent claim, repeated ad nauseam by the mainstream media, that hydroxychloroquine presents some sort of severe heart risk simply isn't true. The cardiovascular risks for hydroxychloroquine are overwhelmingly associated with acute poisoning, often intentional, when used in combination with other antiviral drugs or with prolonged high-dosage use. There is virtually no cardiovascular risk at all to taking it as recommended for short-course treatments, as you would if you took it as a prophylaxis for COVID-19. The case fatality rate for the oldest COVID-19 patients has been reported to rise to more than 14%. Raoul's largest field study of more than 1,000 patients treated with hydroxychloroquine showed that the case fatality rate for the oldest patients dropped to 0.5%. Raoul is by no means the only scientist or doctor to have seemingly proven the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine for treating COVID-19, especially as a prophylactic. Doctors in New York found that hydroxychloroquine treatment increased survival rates. Brazilian doctors discovered treating patients with hydroxychloroquine reduced their chances of requiring hospitalization by nearly 300%, with no notable adverse events. Chinese doctors reduced fever duration and improved the clinical outcomes for patients treated with chloroquine. Doctors in Spain used hydroxychloroquine to increase patient survival rates. Researchers in the United States found that the addition of zinc further improved outcomes. Doctors treating Chinese patients with hydroxychloroquine found no increase in adverse events for their patients. And a systemic review of the available evidence by Indian researchers concluded there is theoretical, experimental, preclinical, and clinical evidence of the effectiveness of chloroquine in patients affected with COVID-19. There is adequate evidence of drug safety from the long-time clinical use of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. End quote. However, if we were to rely on the mainstream media for our information, we would not know any of this. Why are they apparently so eager to convince us that hydroxychloroquine is harmful? Why are the World Health Organization, France's INSERM, and Britain's regulator, the MHRA, determined that hydroxychloroquine trials will not proceed? New section: the problem with hydroxychloroquine. The leading scientific advocates of hydroxychloroquine recommend that it should primarily be used in the early stages of COVID-19, or even prior to developing the syndrome as a prophylactic. Should the person develop the symptoms of COVID-19, they could, for example, begin a course of what has become known as the Marseille treatment, hydroxychloroquine with the antibiotic azithromycin, a treatment abbreviated as HCQ plus AZ, with the further addition of zinc to aid absorption. Struggling to comprehend the seemingly inexplicable resistance to trialling HCQ plus AZ, Professor Harvey Risch, MD of Yale University, argued that HCQ plus AZ protocol should immediately be used as an early therapy for COVID-19 patients. He wrote, "Hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin has been widely misrepresented in both clinical reports and public media. 5 studies including 2 controlled clinical trials, have demonstrated significant major outpatient treatment efficacy. These medications need to be widely available and promoted immediately for physicians to prescribe. End quote. Professor Risch is far from the only eminently qualified opinion questioning the irrational blocking of treatment with hydroxychloroquine. In Michigan, the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons have launched an appeal against a Food and Drug Administration injunction to allow them to prescribe hydroxychloroquine for their COVID-19 patients. The World Health Organization's Solidarity trials to test hydroxychloroquine were launched on the 18th of March. The World Health Organization stated that 400 hospitals in 35 countries had recruited 3,500 patients to take part. At the same time, the World Health Organization launched its Solidarity trial for potential vaccines. The British government did not take part in the World Health Organization's Solidarity trials, instead running its own recovery trial and separate trials COP-COV and Principle. The British Recovery Trial's core funding comes from the Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, and Oxford University, among others. Oxford University is running vaccine trials in partnership with AstraZeneca. The recovery trial was not investigating the prophylactic potential of hydroxychloroquine. The COP-COV trial in Britain was due to assess hydroxychloroquine's prophylactic efficacy in protecting healthcare workers against contracting COVID-19. The Principle trial was perhaps the most relevant of all. Vulnerable British over 50s and people over 65 were to be offered hydroxychloroquine in a large cohort study of patients in primary care, meaning general practice surgeries and community care settings. In France, INSERM ran its own discovery trials in parallel with the World Health Organization's Solidarity trials. Again, the French were only assessing hydroxychloroquine in isolation for the most ill patients. Only the British COP-COV and Principle trials were assessing potential preventive efficacy. COP-COV also had an international arm. However, none of these trials was trialling the recommended Marseille treatment. Initially, INSERM refused point blank to trial hydroxychloroquine at all. 4 days before the launch of the World Health Organization's Solidarity trials, Professor Yazdan Panar, head of France's Health Emergency Rapid Response Committee, abbreviated as REACTing, which stands for Research and Action on Targeting Emerging Infectious Diseases, stated that the discovery trials would exclude chloroquine, i.e. including hydroxychloroquine, and would only trial patented drugs. Quote, "We have not retained it," that is chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, "for the moment, particularly because of its undesirable effects. It also has frequent interactions with other drugs. However, intensive care patients are often treated with multiple drugs." End quote. This followed a decision on the 15th of January made by the then French Minister of Solidarity and Health, Agnès Buzyn, to reclassify hydroxychloroquine in all its forms as a poisonous substance. Prior to this decision, for more than half a century, the French had been able to buy hydroxychloroquine over the counter. Once demand shot through the roof, as the COVID-19 crisis unfolded, they suddenly could no longer get it without a prescription. With the World Health Organization initially including hydroxychloroquine in their Solidarity trials, INSERM had little option but to reluctantly include it in their discovery trials on the launch day of Solidarity trials, the 22nd of March. INSERM stated in their press release, "We analysed the data from the scientific literature concerning the SARS and MERS coronaviruses, as well as the first publications on SARS-CoV-2 from China, to arrive at a list of antiviral molecules to be tested: remdesivir, lopinavir in combination with ritonavir, and hydroxychloroquine. The list of these potential drugs is also based on the list of experimental treatments classified as priorities by the World Health Organization." End French quote. This can be seen as little more than disingenuous backpedaling. The data from the scientific literature hadn't changed in the space of a few days. If the committee known as reacting had previously considered the hydroxychloroquine risks too high, no new evidence had emerged to alter that assessment. New section. Hydroxychloroquine trials abandoned for no reason at all. Within days of the hydroxychloroquine trials starting, on the 22nd of May, The Lancet published a study by a team of 4 US researchers from Brigham and Women's Hospital Center for Advanced Heart Disease. The paper alleged that hydroxychloroquine presented too high a risk of ventricular arrhythmia, heart flutters, and potentially increased mortality for COVID-19 patients. The World Health Organization suspended the hydroxychloroquine Solidarity trials on the 25th of May, 3 days later. American researchers did the same, as did German public health authorities, the French INSERM, and many others. It was the World Health Organization that effectively triggered all the suspensions. The study published in The Lancet was not just a scientific fraud, it was a glaringly obvious scientific fraud. All the data from the Brigham study came from a single source, Surgisphere, which promotes itself as a medical data mining company, and which was founded by one of the study's authors, Dr. Sapan S. Desai. Scientists around the world immediately noticed significant problems with the Surgisphere data. The data were too homogeneous for a global study. It seemed impossible that 4 researchers could collate such a massive hoard of data. Claims that this had all been achieved in a matter of weeks were laughed at by many genuine scientific researchers. Surgisphere claimed it had a global network of participating hospitals requiring global ethics and data protection approval from every individual hospital. These claims were widely considered literally unbelievable. Medical researchers and scientists from around the world wrote an open letter to The Lancet expressing their deep concerns about the study. The Lancet initially offered a minor correction, attempting but failing to account for the erroneous data. Consequently, The Lancet issued a statement saying serious scientific concerns had been brought to their attention. When The Lancet requested that Surgisphere participate in a data audit, it seems Dr. Desai declined. At this point, the 3 authors of the study requested that The Lancet withdraw the paper, which it did on the 3rd of June. Richard Horton, editor of The Lancet, said, "This is a shocking example of research misconduct in the middle of a global health emergency." End quote. Yet, despite the fact that scientists from across the globe were able to spot the fake paper with ease, neither The Lancet nor the world's leading experts in public health, the World Health Organization, could. Instead, they suspended trials of a potentially life-saving medication that had only just begun in the middle of a supposed global pandemic. When the World Health Organization made its suspension on the 26th of May, Britain's MHRA did the same. the MHRA suspended all trials initially, but then reinstated the recovery trial, which was the only trial of the three that is not investigating hydroxychloroquine's potential as a prophylactic. Like the World Health Organization, Britain's MHRA either didn't exercise any due diligence, or they don't care about saving lives. The same day, despite there being no completed British trials of Gilead Sciences' drug remdesivir, the MHRA approved it for hospital treatment of COVID-19 patients anyway. They based this on the expert recommendation of the Commission on Human Medicines. According to the Commission on Human Medicine's Declaration of Interests, pages 141 to 247, there doesn't seem to be a single pharmaceutical corporation which isn't well represented among its members. Gilead Sciences has strong ties with the Commission. The MHRA decision and the Commission on Human Medicine's recommendation followed the release of remdesivir trial data from the United States that suggested that the drug could aid recovery of seriously ill patients by up to 31%. The US National Institute of Health study was funded by the Gates Foundation-backed NIAID, which is headed by Dr. Anthony Fauci. NIAID made a $37.5 million grant in February for the research. Unlike hydroxychloroquine, remdesivir is patented. With 25 years left to run, Gilead Sciences can charge whatever they like for their drug until 2037 at the earliest. A number of other studies have not been able to find any significant benefit from remdesivir. The World Health Organization withdrew some of these unfavorable remdesivir studies from its trial database, as they had accidentally uploaded them. Other remdesivir trials were stopped when adverse effects were observed. Following exposure of the Surgisphere fake science, the World Health Organization initially claimed it would reinstate the hydroxychloroquine solidarity trials. However, this never happened. On the 5th of June, the recovery trial team announced that it had found no benefit from hydroxychloroquine. The chief investigator for the trial, Professor Peter Horby, said, "Hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine have received a lot of attention and have been used very widely to treat COVID patients, despite the absence of any good evidence. The recovery trial has shown that hydroxychloroquine is not an effective treatment in patients hospitalized with COVID-19." End quote. This was immediately reported by the mainstream media, and the World Health Organization announced it had terminated the hydroxychloroquine arm of the Solidarity trials. Citing data from its own trials and from INSERM's discovery trials in France, yet to be released, the World Health Organization stated, "This decision applies only to the conduct of the Solidarity trial and does not apply to the use or evaluation of hydroxychloroquine in pre- or post-exposure prophylaxis in patients exposed to COVID-19." End quote. The only released data has come from the recovery trial, which is also referenced by the World Health Organization. Yet the recovery trial has also been exposed as scientific nonsense. The deputy chief investigator of the recovery trial, Professor Martin Landry, gave an interview to France Soir. What he revealed was quite remarkable. First, the mortality rate of the hydroxychloroquine patients was a staggering 25.7%. 1 in 4 died. The recommended hydroxychloroquine dose for an adult in the United Kingdom is no more than 200 to 400 milligrams per day. In France, 1800 milligrams per day is considered to be lethal poisoning. But across 175 British hospitals, 1,542 patient participants in this recovery trial were given 2,400 milligrams, 6 times the recommended maximum dose, in the first 24 hours. This was followed up at 10 days at twice the recommended maximum dose, at 800 milligrams. It isn't really clear what the objective was. This wasn't so much a trial of effectiveness. It looked more like an experiment in toxic poisoning. That would seem to account for the atrocious mortality rate. Professor Landry, in explaining that the dose was chosen by using computer-generated mathematical models, said the doses were chosen on the basis of pharmacokinetic modeling. And these are in line with the sort of doses that you use for other diseases, such as amoebic dysentery. For a new disease, such as COVID, there is no approved dosing protocol. But the hydroxychloroquine dosage used is not dissimilar to that used, as I said, in, for example, amoebic dysentery. End quote. But it is hydroxyquinoline, not hydroxychloroquine, that's used for the treatment of amoebic dysentery. Perhaps it is not without good reason that Professor Didier Raoul described the recovery trial as the Marx Brothers doing science, though given the terrible death toll, it doesn't really seem like much of a laughing matter. What can we conclude from all this? It seems the World Health Organization, Britain's MHRA, France's INSERM, and public health bodies around the world have used fake science, fake data, deliberately destructive studies, and what appears to be willful ignorance to make sure hydroxychloroquine is never trialed as a preventive treatment for COVID-19. The repeated statements from numerous sources that there is no scientific evidence to justify the use of the Marseille treatment as a prophylactic for COVID-19 are risible. Should it ever be widely acknowledged as effective, the already spurious argument for a COVID-19 vaccine would be wholly untenable. Only the most naive could imagine that there are not many powerful individuals, foundations, and institutions, including governments, who wish to stop the preventive treatment efficacy of HCQ plus AZ with zinc ever being proven. The Indian Council of Medical Research has stated that it will continue to advocate the use of hydroxychloroquine for frontline health workers, as no notable adverse reactions were evident. Dr. Samiran Panda, director of the Council's National AIDS Research Institute, reported the results of Indian trials into its use as a prophylactic treatment for health professionals as follows. Quote, "The main conclusion that can be drawn after analyzing the data is that hydroxychloroquine has beneficial effects in infection risk reduction from the 4th dose onwards. Hydroxychloroquine will help cut the risk of infection by 80% in healthcare workers who are not already sick."